The moment my son-in-law said the words, I knew everything had already been decided. "We found a place for you," he said, swirling the wine in his glass like he was closing a deal. "A really nice one." I smiled, not because I agreed, but because I understood. I had spent 42 years as a risk analyst, quietly teaching corporations how to anticipate catastrophe before it arrived. You learn, in that line of work, to recognize the exact second when the floor disappears beneath your feet long before anyone else realizes they're falling. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you were listening in the comments. This was that second. My daughter, Elaine, sat across from me at my own dining table, the one I had refinished myself decades earlier when she was still small enough to sit on the counter and steal olive from the cutting board. She kept folding and unfolding her napkin, eyes locked somewhere near my collarbone, careful not to meet my gaze. Her husband, Victor, leaned forward, elbows on the mahogany surface, comfortable. Too comfortable. "The facility is in Montclair," he continued. "Private rooms, medical staff on site, social activities, people your own age." My own age. I was 69 years old, not senile. I still drove myself, still managed my finances, still walked the neighborhood every morning before sunrise. But none of that mattered once the narrative had been written. Elaine finally spoke. "Dad, the house is just so big, and you're alone most of the time." The house. There it was. A quiet colonial perched above the Hudson, purchased back when interest rates were brutal and my career was still a question mark. I'd raised my daughter there, buried my wife from there, built my entire adult life inside those walls. Victor smiled again, that polite, professional smile I'd seen him use on waiters, realtors, and people he considered temporary. "Let's be practical," he said. "That property is worth, what, around $3.6 million in today's market? Easily. Maybe more. It's not really being used efficiently." Efficiently. I watched his fingers tighten slightly around the stem of the glass. His fifth pour, if I was counting. And I was. The cold that settled in my chest had nothing to do with the early winter air seeping through the windows. It was recognition, the kind that arrives fully formed, without warning, stripping away every comforting lie you've been telling yourself. They weren't worried about my safety. They were worried about liquidity. "We're not saying you have to decide tonight," Victor added, pouring himself another glass without asking. "But they have availability starting in early summer. And honestly, it just makes sense for everyone." Everyone. The word hung there, heavy and unmistakable. Elaine still wouldn't look at me. I thought of the nights I'd stayed up helping her study for exams. The afternoons spent teaching her how to budget her first paycheck. The way she'd once told me, very seriously, that money was just paper unless it helped people. I wondered when that lesson had been overwritten. "I see," I said quietly. Victor's shoulders relaxed, mistaking restraint for surrender. "They even have a garden," Elaine said quickly. "You'd like that?" I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak, because what I wanted to say was this. "You're already spending my life." But I didn't. I cleared the dishes myself, declined their awkward offers to help, and waited until I heard them climb the stairs to the guest room they'd been occupying for nearly a year now. Temporary, they'd called it. Temporary has a way of stretching when people are comfortable. Later that night, long after the house had settled into silence, I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the dark outline of the trees. Somewhere upstairs, my daughter slept beside the man who had just calmly discussed selling my home while calculating how cheaply he could store me away. They thought I was weak. They thought I was tired. They thought I was already halfway gone. What they didn't see was the other half of my life, the part I'd never felt the need to announce. The decades spent building systems, advising corporations, structuring entities so quietly and thoroughly that my name barely appeared on paper anymore. They saw a retired man in an expensive house. They didn't see the strategist. They didn't see the contingency plans. They didn't see the board already set. I went to my study then, past framed photographs Elaine and Victor had never once commented on, past a bookshelf filled with titles I doubted either of them had ever opened. I opened the hidden panel behind the old landscape painting and removed a folder I hadn't touched in months. Inside were documents Elaine had never asked about, Victor never bothered to ask about holding company agreements, advisory contracts, acquisition drafts, numbers that didn't fit their version of me. I sat down, exhaled slowly, and allowed myself to accept the truth I'd been avoiding. My daughter and her husband weren't planning for my future. They were planning around my absence. And if they wanted to treat my life like a line item on a spreadsheet, then they were about to learn a lesson I had spent 4 decades teaching others. Always understand who you're dealing with. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was angry. Anger is loud, unfocused, wasteful. What I felt instead was something colder, something far more useful. The kind of clarity that arrives when denial finally exhausts itself and leaves nothing behind but truth. I walked the house long after midnight, each step deliberate, careful not to wake them. The floors creaked in familiar places, places I'd learned decades ago when Elaine was a child sneaking down for water after bedtime. I remembered which boards betrayed you and which ones stayed loyal. Funny how houses remember things people forget. Her old bedroom was no longer hers. Victor had converted it into a makeshift office, cables coiled like vines around the desk, a second monitor glowing faintly with spreadsheets and projections. Startup ideas by the look of it. Buzzwords. Forecasts that assumed optimism where discipline should have lived. I stood there longer than I meant to. I remembered sitting on that same carpet teaching Elaine how to balance her first checkbook, how she'd frowned in concentration, tongue pressed against her lip, before looking up at me and saying, "So money's just a tool, right?" Exactly, sweetheart. A tool, not a goal. Downstairs, the living room still smelled faintly of lemon oil from the polish I'd used earlier that week. On the mantel sat a photograph Victor had never once commented on. Elaine at 9 years old, front teeth missing, holding a soccer trophy nearly as tall as she was. She'd run straight past her teammates that day, straight to me. "Did you see?" she'd asked breathlessly. "Did you see me score?" I had seen everything. Now, she couldn't even look at me while discussing where to send me when I became inconvenient. By morning, something in me had shifted permanently. Not snapped, settled. Over the next 2 weeks, I became what I had already been reduced to in their minds: background. I made coffee earlier, ate quietly, spoke only when spoken to, let conversations pass over me like weather. It was astonishing how quickly people stop seeing you once they've decided you're finished. Victor took calls openly now, pacing the kitchen while Elaine scrolled through comparison websites at the dining table. Assisted living facilities filtered by price, not quality. Price. "This one's only $3,800 a month," she said once, turning the screen toward him. "And it's closer to transit." Victor nodded. "Good. If he's there long term, that matters." If. I pour my coffee carefully. Too carefully. What if he needs more care later? Elaine asked. Victor shrugged without looking up from his phone. "Then we move him somewhere cheaper. At that point, it won't really make a difference." I took my mug and left the room before my hands betrayed me. In my study, I closed the door and stood still until the noise in my chest faded back into something manageable. I had spent a lifetime training myself to separate emotion from decision-making. This was no different, except the stakes were personal. I pulled the folder from behind the painting again. Hawthorne Advisory Group. That was the name now. Quiet, unassuming. A restructuring I'd completed years earlier when I stepped back from public-facing work. The firm still consulted on corporate risk mitigation, mergers, compliance frameworks. I still owned the controlling interest. I simply let others do the talking. Most people never asked what I did before retirement. Victor never asked at all. I scrolled through messages on my phone. Updates from Martin Shaw, my managing partner. A note about a pending acquisition that had been inching along for months now. North Shore Mutual, Victor's employer. The irony would have been amusing if it hadn't been so precise it bordered on poetic. I had not orchestrated the acquisition because of Victor. That distinction mattered. The process had begun long before that dinner. Long before the nursing home brochures appeared on my table. But now, the timing felt less like coincidence and more like inevitability. Patterns tend to converge. I spent those days listening, observing, letting them talk freely under the assumption that I was already halfway gone. Victor was confident. Too confident. He talked about quitting his job once everything was settled, about focusing on his venture full-time once the house was sold, about how the equity would change everything. Elaine grew quieter. She started skipping meals, lost weight. Her voice carried hesitation now, questions she never quite finished asking. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But noticing does not mean intervening. Not yet. At night, I documented everything. Dates, conversations, exact phrasing. Not because I plan to use it against them, but because facts are anchors. When people rewrite history, records hold the line. I scheduled a meeting downtown under the guise of a lunch appointment. Took the long route just in case. Old habits die hard. Martin greeted me with a grin when I arrived. Didn't expect to see you back in the city so soon. Circumstances change, I said. We reviewed the acquisition status. Regulatory approval pending. Announcement projected for early summer. Leadership transition discussions underway. Do you want to remain hands-off? He asked. Or are you thinking of stepping in this time? I thought of Victor swirling wine at my table, of Elaine folding her napkin, of brochures spread where family photos used to sit. I want oversight, I said. Operational. Direct. Martin raised an eyebrow. That's a shift. So, is being told where you'll live when you're still perfectly capable of deciding for yourself. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't need it. That afternoon, I met with my attorney, updated my medical evaluations, reviewed my estate documents, ensured everything was unambiguous, airtight, impossible to reinterpret. If they wanted to question my competence, I would leave no room for doubt. When I returned home, Victor was in the living room, phone pressed to his ear, laughing. He's coming around, he said to whoever was on the other end. Old guy didn't even push back. Just needs a little nudge. I walked past without comment. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I allowed myself one final moment of grief. For the man I'd thought Victor was. For the daughter I believed I'd raised. For the version of myself who still thought silence would preserve peace. Then I closed that chapter. Preparation finished quietly. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They simply arrive when the math is done. Once people decide you are weak, they stop imagining resistance. That is the great advantage of being underestimated. I let Victor believe his confidence was earned. Let Elaine believe silence was compliance. I nodded when they spoke about timelines. Asked questions that sounded like confusion rather than calculation. How long does it usually take to sell a house like this? I asked one morning. Victor didn't bother hiding his satisfaction. In this market, a few weeks, maybe a month if we price it right. In the place in Montclair, I added mildly. What's the move-in process? Elaine answered quickly. Too quickly. They just need a deposit. Then we'd coordinate logistics. Logistics. That was what my life had become to them. After breakfast, I retreated to my study and closed the door. The safe clicked open softly. The sound as familiar to me as breathing. Inside were documents I had updated the week before medical evaluations signed by 2 independent physicians, cognitive assessments that would make any argument of decline collapse under scrutiny. Competence, documented. I scanned through my calendar and made 3 calls that afternoon. The first was to Martin. I want full access to personnel performance files at North Shore Mutual, I said. Management level and above. Particularly mid-tier leadership. There was a pause. That's sensitive territory. I own the controlling stake, I reminded him. And I'll be assuming operational oversight once the acquisition closes. Another pause, shorter this time. I'll prepare the files. The second call was to my accountant. I need a complete financial disclosure, I told her. Assets, income streams, trusts, holding structures. Everything. She laughed softly. Planning something dramatic? Preventing something dishonest. She understood that, too. The third call was harder. Elaine was in the kitchen when I returned, staring at her phone with the same distant expression she'd worn for weeks now. I watched her for a moment before speaking. You seem tired, I said gently. She startled. Oh, yeah, just a lot going on. I nodded. You don't have to manage everything at once, you know. Her eyes flickered up to mine, searching for something. Permission, perhaps. Or absolution. Victor's voice drifted down from upstairs. He was on another call, speaking loudly, confidently, the sound of a man already spending money he did not yet have. Elaine looked away. "I just want everyone to be okay," she said. So did I. But we wanted very different definitions of what that meant. That evening, Victor brought home takeout and spread brochures across the table again. Floor plans, amenities, pricing tiers. "June makes sense," he said. "We don't want to drag this out." "June." I smiled faintly. "That's soon." "Well," he said, glancing at Elaine, "better to act while everything's stable." I wondered what he thought stability looked like. In my study later, I reviewed the first batch of files Martin had sent over. Victor Palmer, middle management, sales operations. The pattern emerged quickly. Inflated projections, missed targets reframed as external issues, expense reports that skirted the edge of policy without crossing it outright, charm where discipline should have been, noise where substance was required. Nothing criminal. Worse, mediocre. The kind of performance that survives only when no one is really paying attention. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me. I felt no satisfaction, only confirmation. If Victor had been exceptional, this would have been harder. If he had been genuinely good at his job, perhaps I might have chosen another path. But he wasn't. He was adequate, and adequacy collapses under scrutiny. The acquisition announcement date moved closer. Elaine and Victor grew bolder. Realtors were mentioned casually. One even stopped by just to take a look, Victor said, as if the house weren't still very much my own. I allowed it. Every step they took built a record. Every assumption they made tightened the snare. Late one night, I received a message from Martin. Regulatory approval confirmed. Announcement scheduled. Leadership briefings to follow. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then placed the phone face down on the desk. There would be no quiet retreat now. No way for Victor to back out gracefully. No version of this where consequences soften themselves out of courtesy. Once power is revealed, it cannot be unseen. Upstairs, I heard Elaine moving around, restless. I wondered if she sensed the shift, if some instinct buried deep beneath denial was already whispering that things were about to change. I almost hoped she did, because the next phase would not be kind. And once it began, it would not stop simply because regret arrived late. The kind of morning that tricks you into believing nothing significant is about to happen. Victor left early that day, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror, phone already pressed to his ear. He looked light. The announcement came on a Monday. Clear sky, mild air, the kind of morning that tricks you into believing nothing significant is about to happen. Victor left early that day, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror, phone already pressed to his ear. He looked lighter than he had in weeks, buoyed by the illusion that his future was finally accelerating. I watched him from the study window as he backed out of the driveway. "Big week," he said over his shoulder. "Wish me luck." I smiled politely. "Always," I replied. He had no idea. At 10 o'clock sharp, my phone vibrated. "Martin, it's public," he said. "Press release is live. Internal memos going out now." "Good," I said. "I'll be there tomorrow." There was a brief silence on the line. "You're sure you want to be visible?" "Yes." I ended the call and sat very still. For years, I had preferred the background. Influence without exposure. Control without spectacle. It made life simpler. But simplicity is a luxury you surrender the moment someone decides your life belongs to them. The first sign something was wrong came that afternoon. Victor returned home earlier than usual, his confidence frayed around the edges. He moved through the house too quickly, restless, phone clutched in his hand like a life raft. "Do you know a company called Hawthorne Advisory?" he asked, trying to sound casual. I looked up from my book. "I do." His eyes sharpened. "They just acquired North Shore Mutual. Full integration." "So I hear," I said mildly. He laughed, but the sound was thin. "Corporate reshuffling, right? Probably nothing to worry about." "Probably." He poured himself a drink without asking. Then another. "I might have some meetings coming up," he added. "Evaluations. You know how these things go." "I do," I said. That night, Elaine barely touched her dinner. The next morning, I dressed carefully. Charcoal suit, white shirt, a tie I hadn't worn in years. not out of nostalgia, but because it still fit. Some things, when properly maintained, do not deteriorate with time. The North Shore Mutual building rose clean and modern against the skyline. Glass, steel, quiet confidence. I arrived early, greeted by a young man from Human Resources who shook my hand with visible respect. "Mr. Hale," he said, "it's an honor. Your work is still referenced in training." I inclined my head. "Ancient history. Still relevant," he replied. The conference room filled slowly. Department heads, managers, familiar faces Victor had likely complained to about his impossible father-in-law. He arrived last, coffee in hand, relaxed, distracted. He didn't recognize me at first. Stephen from Human Resources cleared his throat. "As you all know, North Shore Mutual has officially entered into an acquisition with Hawthorne Advisory Group. Today, we're welcoming the operational controller who will be overseeing the integration and performance review process." Victor straightened. "Please welcome Mr. Thomas Hale." I stood. The sound Victor made was small, involuntary, a sharp intake of breath that caught somewhere between disbelief and panic. His coffee cup froze halfway to the table. Color drained from his face in stages, like a dimmer being turned slowly down. Pink to pale, pale to gray. I met his eyes. "Good morning," I said calmly. For those unfamiliar with my background, I've spent over 4 decades in risk assessment and corporate governance. Hawthorne Advisory acquired North Shore Mutual to strengthen operational discipline and long-term stability. I paused. This process will involve a comprehensive evaluation of management-level performance. Victor's hands began to shake. I saw it clearly now, the exact moment understanding landed. Not just that I was there, but that I had always been there, watching, calculating, waiting. "Mr. Palmer," I said gently. "You look surprised." He tried to speak. Failed. Tried again. This isn't possible." "It is," I replied, "and it's been in motion for quite some time." The room was silent. People glanced between us, sensing a tension they didn't yet understand. "Over the coming weeks," I continued, "I'll be meeting with each of you individually. We'll review metrics, decision-making processes, and value contribution. Transparency will be essential." My gaze returned to Victor. "Mr. Palmer, we'll start with you. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. His chair scraped softly as he shifted, knuckles white against the table. The meeting ended without applause, without drama. But Victor didn't move. As the room emptied, he stood slowly, as if gravity itself had changed. "You did this on purpose," he said hoarsely. "Because of the house." I met his eyes steadily. "No," I said. "I did this because you decided I was disposable." Then I gathered my papers and left him there, standing alone in the wreckage of his assumptions. The days that followed were quiet on the surface. That was intentional. Victor expected confrontation, accusations, some dramatic reckoning where emotions spilled and lines were crossed. When none of that came, it unsettled him more than anger ever could have. At work, I treated him exactly as I treated everyone else, which is to say, thoroughly. Our first one-on-one meeting began at 9 o'clock sharp. Victor arrived early, a first for him, suit wrinkled despite his effort, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He sat rigidly across from me, hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. "Let's begin with your department overview," I said, opening my folder. "Walk me through your operational priorities over the last 18 months. He cleared his throat. "Of course, I've focused on growth initiatives, client retention strategies, and streamlining workflows." I nodded. "Streamlining implies measurable efficiency. What were the outcomes?" He hesitated, then spoke quickly. "We saw moderate improvements. Market conditions were challenging." "Market conditions are always challenging," I replied evenly. "That's why metrics matter." I slid a single page across the desk. "Expense summaries, approval chains, time-stamped decisions. Help me understand these variances," I said. His eyes darted across the page. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. "I need to check the context," he said. "Please do," I replied. "I'll expect a written explanation by Friday." By Friday. He nodded stiffly. This pattern repeated itself across meetings. I asked for documentation. He promised explanations. Deadlines tightened, not arbitrarily but precisely enough to expose habits he had relied on for years. Charm did not translate well into spreadsheets. At home, the atmosphere shifted. Victor stopped pouring wine at dinner, stopped pacing confidently through rooms that no longer felt like his. He spent evenings hunched over his laptop, muttering under his breath, papers spread across the table where brochures once lay. Elaine watched him with growing unease. "You should talk to my father," she said one night. "Clear the air." Victor snapped his laptop shut. "There is no air to clear. He's doing this on purpose." She flinched. "Maybe if you acknowledged Dash." "Acknowledged what?" he interrupted. "That he's humiliating me? That he planned this to punish us?" I said nothing from my seat at the far end of the table. Silence, in moments like that, is not avoidance. It is documentation. The assignments grew more complex. An operational audit, process flow analysis, cost-benefit justification for decisions dating back nearly 2 years. "This is impossible," Victor said during our second meeting. "This would take a team weeks." "Then you should assemble one," I replied. "Leadership involves delegation." His jaw tightened. "You're doing this because of a nursing home." I met his gaze calmly. "I'm doing this because I'm responsible for ensuring this company is competently managed. If that feels personal, perhaps you should examine why." He stormed out. 2 days later, Human Resources called. Victor had filed a complaint. Conflict of interest, hostile oversight, retaliation. I read the document carefully, noting the irony. In attempting to escape scrutiny, he had formally acknowledged my authority over him. I smiled. At home, Elaine confronted me in my study. "Dad," she said, voice trembling, "this has gone too far." I set my pen down slowly. Too far was deciding where I would live without asking me. Her eyes filled. "We thought we were helping. You were planning," I corrected gently. "Without consent." She sank into the chair across from me. "He's falling apart." "I know," I said. "And you're okay with that?" I considered the question. "I'm okay with accountability," I said finally. "The rest is a consequence, not a goal." That night, Victor drank alone in the living room. Lights off, the glow of his phone reflecting off half-empty glassware. I passed him on my way upstairs. "Tomorrow morning," I said quietly, "your audit draft is due." He didn't look up, but his hands were shaking. Desperation rarely announces itself loudly at first. It begins with paperwork. The envelope arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by courier rather than mail. Thick, heavy, deliberate. I knew what it was before I opened it. Victor's attorney. I carried it into my study and closed the door, the familiar ritual grounding me. Inside were allegations carefully worded to sound serious without committing to anything provable. Conflict of interest, abuse of authority, psychological harassment, and buried near the end, almost as an afterthought, a suggestion that my advanced age might impair my judgment. That one almost made me laugh. Almost. I called Martin first. "He's escalating," he said after I summarized the contents. "This could get messy." "It already is," I replied. "The difference is that I prepared for it." My attorney, Rebecca Lynn, arrived that evening. She had been with me for years, precise and unsentimental, the kind of lawyer who read footnotes before headlines. She skimmed the complaint once, then again more slowly. "This is thin," she said. "Emotionally charged but light on substance." "Good," I said. "Then let's respond with facts." She nodded. "We'll request an independent review, external auditors, full transparency, and I'll undergo a cognitive evaluation," I added. Rebecca paused. "You don't have to." "I know," I said. "That's why I will." The evaluation was thorough. Hours of testing, memory, reasoning, pattern recognition. The results were unequivocal. Superior executive function, above average processing speed, no evidence of cognitive decline. Rebecca framed the summary and placed it on my desk at North Shore Mutual the following week. Petty, perhaps, but clarity has its place. Victor's reaction was immediate. "You planned this," he said when we crossed paths in the hallway. "You're humiliating me." "I'm documenting reality," I replied. "The difference matters." At home, the tension finally fractured. Elaine found me in the kitchen late one night, sitting at the table where brochures had once been spread. "I didn't think it would turn into this," she said quietly. "Lawyers, complaints, all of it." I looked at her carefully. "Did you think selling my house would be simple?" She flinched. "He says you're enjoying this," she continued, "that you're punishing him." "I'm responding," I said. "There's a difference." She wiped at her eyes. "He's scared. So was I said gently, when I realized my own daughter had decided where I would spend the rest of my life without asking me. She didn't respond to that. Victor tried one last tactic. He demanded reassignment. Claimed bias made continued supervision impossible. Human Resources reviewed the request, the documentation, the audits. Denied. The company offered him two options instead: additional oversight with support, or voluntary resignation. Neither was what he wanted. At home, he packed a bag in silence. "I need space," he told Elaine. "Time to think." She watched him leave without stopping him. I stood at the window as his car disappeared down the street, feeling no triumph. Only the dull recognition that consequences rarely confine themselves to their intended target. The next morning, Rebecca called. "He's out of moves," she said. "If he pushes further, the audit results won't be kind." I looked around my study, at the photographs, the books, the life I had nearly been asked to abandon. "Then we wait," I said, "because when someone builds their future on the assumption that you won't fight back, the collapse is never sudden. It's slow and inevitable." The conference room felt smaller than usual, not because it had changed, but because no one inside it had anywhere left to hide. Victor sat across from me, shoulders slumped, the sharp edge he once carried dulled into something brittle. His attorney sat beside him, flipping through the audit binder with increasing urgency. Each page, she turned deep in the lines between her brows. Stephen from Human Resources cleared his throat. "The independent review is complete," he said. "Findings have been verified." Victor's lawyer finally closed the binder and leaned back. "You should have told me," she murmured to him. "This isn't defensible." Victor didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the table, hands clasped so tightly they trembled. I spoke only when necessary. "Mr. Palmer," I said evenly, "the audit identified repeated lapses in judgment, misallocation of resources, and approval patterns that resulted in documented financial losses exceeding $140,000. His head snapped up. "That's exaggerated." "Those figures were confirmed by external auditors," Stephen replied. "They are conservative." Silence settled heavily over the room. Under company policy, Stephen continued, "You are being offered two options: immediate termination with cause, which will be reflected in your employment record, or voluntary resignation, effective immediately with a neutral reference." Victor's lawyer leaned close and whispered something urgent. Victor looked at me then. "You destroyed everything," he said hoarsely. "My career, my marriage, all of it." I met his gaze calmly. "No," I said. "You destroyed it when you decided another human being was disposable." He laughed bitterly. "Over a house. Over dignity," I corrected. "The house was just how you justified it." His shoulders sagged. "I'll resign," he said quietly. The paperwork was signed within minutes. No raised voices. No drama. Just the soft sound of a pen scratching across paper. When the door closed behind him, no one spoke for several seconds. "That was thorough," Stephen said at last. "It had to be," I replied. That evening, Elaine waited for me in the living room. "He called," she said. "He's leaving the state. Found something temporary out west." She swallowed. "He said you won." I sat down slowly. "And what do you think?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and something deeper. "I think I lost something I didn't know I could lose," she said. "And I think you did too." She wasn't wrong. That night, the house felt cavernous. Too quiet. The absence Victor left behind was not peace, but aftermath. I found Elaine later in her old room, sitting on the floor surrounded by photo albums, the past spread out in glossy fragments. "I don't recognize myself," she said softly. "I became someone who could plan her father's life like a transaction." I lowered myself beside her. "You can choose differently going forward," I said. "That matters." She nodded, tears falling freely now. Outside, The lights of the neighborhood glowed steadily, indifferent to our reckoning. Justice had been served. But justice, I was learning, does not mend what betrayal breaks. Autumn arrived gently, the kind of season that doesn't demand attention, but rewards those who notice it anyway. Mornings cooled. Leaves along the street turned from green to copper, then fell without ceremony. Life, as it always does, continued. The house remained. That alone felt like a victory, though I had learned not to confuse possession with peace. Elaine stayed, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, at least not entirely, but because she had nowhere else to go yet. She found work at a local nonprofit, administrative, modest, and insisted on paying rent even when I told her it wasn't necessary. "I need to earn my footing," she said. "Otherwise, I'll forget how easy it is to take things for granted." I didn't argue. Some lessons must be reinforced daily. We moved around each other carefully at first, like survivors of a shared disaster unsure which ground was still stable. We spoke politely, occasionally warmly, never casually. Trust, once broken, does not return all at once. It arrives in fragments. One morning, I found her in the garden, kneeling in the soil beneath the old maple tree. She had dirt on her hands, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back the way she used to wear it when she was a teenager. "I thought the roses needed trimming," she said, glancing up at me. "I hope that's okay." "They do," I replied. "You're doing it right." She smiled faintly, and for a moment I saw the child she had been, not the woman she had nearly become. Victor was gone. California, last I heard. Some small firm willing to take a chance on experience stripped of reputation. His startup never materialized. That, too, felt inevitable. He sent one message. Short, bitter, accusatory. "You took everything from me." I never replied, because the truth was simpler and far less flattering. He had taken everything from himself the moment he decided another human being was expendable. North Shore Mutual stabilized quickly after the transition. New leadership, clearer accountability, fewer conversations built on confidence alone. Martin joked once that my unexpected return had sharpened everyone's focus. I stepped back again soon after. I had made my point. I did not need to remain visible to maintain control. One afternoon, sitting on the back deck with a cup of coffee warming my hands, Elaine joined me. We watched the wind move through the trees in silence. "Do you ever wish you'd handled it differently?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," I said, "but wishing doesn't change outcomes. It only softens responsibility." She nodded slowly. "I thought money would fix things, make life easier." "It often does," I said, "until it asks you to pay in ways you didn't expect." She looked down at her hands. "I hate that it took losing everything to see that." "So do I," I replied. "But seeing it at all matters." She reached out then, tentative, and rested her hand over mine. The gesture was small, uncertain, and profoundly meaningful. It did not repair the past, but it acknowledged it. Later that evening, I walked through the house alone. The way I had on the night, everything changed. The rooms felt different now, not lighter, not heavier, just altered, as though the walls themselves had absorbed what had happened and adjusted accordingly. I stopped in my study and looked at the framed cognitive evaluation still hanging above my desk. Superior executive function. The words felt almost absurd now. Competence had never really been the issue. Respect had. I removed the frame and placed it in a drawer. I didn't need proof anymore. The people who mattered had learned the truth the hard way. The cherry tree in the yard shed its last leaves that week. Elaine and I raked them together, working quietly, efficiently, without needing to fill the silence. This, I realized, was the aftermath. Not triumph, not celebration, but continuity. I had protected my life, my home, my autonomy. I had refused to be reduced to a line item, refused to be quietly erased for someone else's convenience. That mattered. It would always matter. But I had also learned something I had spent decades advising others to remember and somehow forgotten myself. Every calculation has a cost. You can win decisively and still grieve what victory required. Justice does not heal relationships. It clarifies them. I looked at my daughter changed, humbled, trying, and understood that what we were building now would never resemble what we'd had before. It would be slower, harder, more honest. Perhaps that was the only kind worth having. They had thought I was finished. They had thought age made me weak. They had thought silence meant surrender. They were wrong. But being right, I had learned, is not the same as being untouched. The house stood quiet behind me, solid, earned mine. That was my victory, and its price